What if one moment could change everything? Imagine sitting in a courtroom, ready to do your job, when suddenly you lock eyes with the defendant, and in that instant, your past collides with your present. The person standing trial isn't just another name on a case file. He's someone you once knew, someone you once trusted. Would you be able to stay impartial? Would you follow the law, even if something deep inside you whispered that the truth might be different? This story isn't just about a verdict. It's about justice, about the weight of assumptions, and about the choices that define us. If you believe in stories that challenge perspectives, that make you think, that stay with you long after they're told, then you're in the right place. Hit like if this story moves you. Subscribe if you want more content that truly matters. Your support helps keep these powerful stories alive, because sometimes a single story can change everything. The courtroom buzzed with its usual energy. Attorneys flipping through case files, reporters scribbling in their notepads, and spectators whispering in hushed voices. Judge Naomi Carter adjusted her robe, her expression impassive, as she scanned the docket in front of her. It was another case, another defendant, another day spent ensuring justice was served. The bailiff cleared his throat and announced the case: the state of Illinois versus Marcus Reed. Naomi barely reacted at first. Another name on the list, another troubled soul caught in the system. She skimmed the charges: armed robbery, assault, resisting arrest. A familiar weight settled in her chest. These cases never got easier. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and the defendant was led in, wrists and ankles shackled. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. She knew him. Marcus Reed. Her Marcus. The man standing before her, clad in an orange jumpsuit, was not the boy she remembered from the south side of Chicago. His once proud posture was slouched, his face worn by years of hardship. But his eyes, those deep, familiar eyes, hadn't changed. Naomi's grip on her gavel faltered. For the first time in her career, she hesitated. Marcus lifted his gaze, and recognition flickered across his face. A silent understanding passed between them, but it was gone as quickly as it came. His shoulders tensed, and he turned his eyes to the ground. The courtroom waited. Naomi forced herself to speak, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Mr. Reed, you stand accused of armed robbery and assault. How do you plead?" His voice was rough, almost unrecognizable. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Naomi's pulse pounded in her ears. She wanted to stop everything, to demand answers. "What happened to you, Marcus? How did we end up here on opposite sides of the courtroom?" But her role as a judge demanded composure. "Proceed," she said, her tone firmer than she felt. The prosecutor, a sharp-suited man named Daniel Whitaker, launched into his opening statement. Naomi barely heard him. Her mind drifted, memories unraveling like old film reels. She and Marcus had been inseparable once. They grew up on the same block, where cracked sidewalks and rusted fences told stories of struggle. Her mother worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, while Marcus was raised by his grandmother after his father was sent to prison. They met at the neighborhood basketball court when she was 10 and he was 12. She had wandered onto the court, determined to prove she could keep up with the older kids. Marcus had laughed when she missed every shot, but then he showed her how to hold her stance, how to aim, how to follow through. That was the start. Through sweltering summers and bitter winters, they became each other's refuge. Late-night conversations on the rooftop, where they whispered dreams of escaping the city. Naomi wanted to be a lawyer, to fight the system that had failed so many. Marcus had bigger dreams, to own a business, to build something of his own. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he had asked one night, staring at the city lights. "All the time," she had admitted. But life had other plans. The summer before Naomi left for college, everything changed. A robbery at the corner store. A friend of Marcus's caught up in something dangerous. Police sirens in the distance. And then, Marcus was gone. Naomi had tried to find him, to ask what had happened, but he disappeared from her life as quickly as the seasons changed. She left Chicago, determined to build a future, and eventually she stopped searching for the boy who had been her closest friend. And now, he stood before her, accused of a crime that could take away his freedom forever. She forced herself back to the present as the prosecutor's words cut through her thoughts. "This case is about violence," Whitaker declared, his voice cold and precise. The evidence will show that the defendant entered a convenience store, attacked the clerk, and emptied the register before fleeing the scene. Naomi's gaze flickered to Marcus. His hands were clasped in front of him, his face unreadable. But she knew him. She had seen that expression before, on the night her father told her to stay away from Marcus Reed for good. The defense attorney, Camille Dawson, stood. "The prosecution wants you to believe this case is simple," she said, her voice firm. "But the truth is far more complicated. Mr. Reed has maintained his innocence from the moment of his arrest, and we will present evidence that calls the prosecution's claims into question." The first witness, the store clerk, took the stand. Naomi watched as he recounted the night of the crime. His voice was steady, his words practiced, too practiced. Doubt flickered in Naomi's mind. Could Marcus really have done this, or was the system setting him up for failure, just like it had so many times before? As the testimony continued, Naomi kept her expression neutral, but inside, she was unraveling. How was she supposed to judge a man whose past was intertwined with hers? How was she supposed to uphold the law when, for the first time, she wasn't sure justice was on the prosecution's side? The past and the present were colliding in a way she never expected. And Naomi knew, before this trial was over, she would have to make a choice that could change everything. Naomi Carter sat motionless at the bench, her fingers curled tightly around the edge. The courtroom felt smaller, suffocating even, as Marcus Reed sat across from her, his future hanging in the balance. The prosecutor, Daniel Whitaker, strode confidently toward the jury, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "This case is about violence," he repeated, his voice crisp and deliberate. "Mr. Reed attacked an innocent store clerk, stole from the register, and was caught mere blocks from the scene. The evidence is clear." Naomi felt the weight of his words pressing against her chest. She had read the police report twice before taking the bench that morning. The security footage showed a man in a dark hoodie lunging over the counter. The store clerk swore he recognized Marcus as the attacker. The cash was found in his possession. It all looked airtight. But then why did something feel off? She turned her gaze to Marcus. His head was lowered, his hands clasped together, but his shoulders were squared. He wasn't pleading, wasn't posturing, just waiting. Did he believe justice would save him? Or had he already decided that the system would fail him, just like it had so many times before? The defense attorney, Camille Dawson, adjusted her blazer and stood. "The prosecution wants you to believe this is simple," she said, her voice unwavering. "But what they won't tell you is how many assumptions this case is built on. My client has pleaded not guilty because he is not guilty. The evidence is circumstantial, and we intend to prove that." Naomi studied Camille. She was young but sharp, the kind of lawyer Naomi herself had once been, the kind that still believed the law could be bent toward justice. The prosecution called their first witness, the store clerk. A middle-aged man with thinning hair, he recounted the night of the crime with precision. "He came in, looked around, then got into it with my cashier. The next thing I knew, he was reaching over the counter, and then, bam, he hit the guy." Camille stepped forward. "Mr. Jenkins, you testified that the assailant was wearing a dark hoodie. Do you recall any distinguishing marks, tattoos, scars?" Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. "No, it was dark, but I recognized him." Camille's eyebrow arched. "You recognized him, even though he had his hood up, and you didn't see his face clearly?" Jenkins hesitated, then nodded. I just know." A whisper rippled through the courtroom. Naomi could feel the jury's attention shifting, uncertainty creeping in. The next piece of evidence was the grainy security footage. The prosecutor played it once, then again in slow motion. The man in the video moved fast, but the poor lighting made it impossible to distinguish his face. Camille leaned over the defense table and whispered something to Marcus, who barely reacted. Naomi inhaled slowly, controlling the storm inside her. Could Marcus really have done this? Or was she seeing what she wanted to see? The boy she once knew, the boy she had left behind. The judge's robe felt heavier than ever. As the court adjourned for lunch, Naomi retreated to her chambers. Her assistant, Lisa, knocked hesitantly. "Judge Carter, are you all right?" Naomi exhaled, composing herself. "I'm fine." But she wasn't. Pause for a moment. Imagine being in Naomi's position, sitting in a courtroom, knowing that one decision could alter a person's life forever. What would you do? Would you trust the system, even when something felt wrong? Or would you risk everything to uncover the truth? This story isn't just fiction. It mirrors the real-world struggles of justice, bias, and second chances. How often do we judge people based on their past rather than who they are now? Have you ever been unfairly labeled? Drop a comment below. Let's talk about it. When court resumed, Camille called her next witness, Officer Daryl Hughes, the arresting officer. Naomi leaned forward slightly. This is where the cracks might show. Camille stepped closer to the witness stand. Officer Hughes, you stated in your report that my client was arrested 2 blocks from the scene of the crime. What made you stop him? Hughes shifted, clearing his throat. He matched the description. Camille nodded. A black male, mid-30s, wearing dark clothing. Did you find a dark hoodie on him? Hughes hesitated. No, but that doesn't mean he didn't have one. Camille's lips pressed into a thin line. Did you search the surrounding area for the missing hoodie? No, we apprehended him quickly, Hughes admitted. Quickly, Camille repeated. So no weapon, no hoodie, just a man walking home? Hughes's jaw tightened. We followed protocol. Naomi's stomach twisted. She glanced at the jury. A few members exchanged looks. The doubt was spreading. Then Camille asked, Officer Hughes, did my client say anything when you arrested him? Hughes exhaled through his nose. He protested, said he was innocent. Camille stepped forward. Did you investigate that claim or did you assume he was guilty? Silence. Naomi's grip tightened on her gavel. This case was crumbling. Marcus sat motionless, his expression unreadable. He had been fighting for his life long before this courtroom, long before this case. And Naomi, she was realizing, piece by piece, that justice wasn't just about evidence. It was about people. And sometimes the truth was buried deeper than any case file. Officer Harris, do you recall if Mr. Reed said anything at the time of his arrest? Lisa Dawson's voice was calm but sharp. Her eyes locked onto the officer sitting on the witness stand. Officer Harris shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. He protested, said he was innocent. Lisa took a slow step forward. And did you consider investigating that claim, or did you assume guilt based on his appearance and proximity to the scene? A tense silence filled the courtroom. Harris's fingers clenched on the edge of the stand. I followed protocol, he muttered. Lisa let the words hang in the air before turning back toward the jury. Protocol, she repeated, her voice laced with skepticism. No weapon was found on Mr. Reed, no hoodie matching the one in the video, no physical evidence tying him to the crime. But protocol was followed. Naomi Carter's grip tightened on her gavel. The jury members exchanged glances, uncertainty creeping into their expressions. She could feel it, the shift, the doubt growing among them. Lisa was peeling away the certainty the prosecution had tried so hard to establish. Whitaker, the prosecutor, rose for cross-examination. Officer Harris, did Mr. Reed have any explanation for why he was near the scene of the crime? Harris straightened, regaining his composure. He claimed he was walking home from a friend's house. Whitaker nodded. And did this so-called friend provide an alibi for him? Harris exhaled sharply. No, the friend refused to testify. Naomi didn't miss the way Whitaker's lips curled slightly, as if that answer had cemented his case. He turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not ignore what's obvious. If Mr. Reed was truly innocent, why wouldn't his own friend vouch for him? Lisa stood quickly. Objection. Speculation. Sustained, Naomi said, keeping her tone neutral. Whitaker raised his hands in mock surrender, then turned back to Harris. Nothing further. Lisa sat down beside Marcus, whispering something to him. He nodded slightly, but his face remained unreadable. The next witness took the stand, a forensic analyst. Whitaker led the questioning, walking the expert through the surveillance footage, emphasizing that while grainy, the figure's build and height matched Marcus. Lisa, however, was ready. Dr. Franklin, in your professional opinion, can you say with 100% certainty that the man in the footage is Marcus Reed? The analyst hesitated. The footage is inconclusive. Based on proportions, it's possible, but I cannot say definitively. Lisa's expression didn't change, but Naomi caught the quick glint of satisfaction in her eyes. The jury was listening. The prosecution rested their case, and the courtroom fell into a tense silence as Naomi called for a recess. Naomi retreated to her chambers, closing the door behind her with more force than necessary. She pressed her palms against the cool surface of her desk. inhaling deeply. Every logical part of her knew she had to remain impartial. But the boy she had once known, the boy who had shared his dreams with her under the city lights, was sitting in that courtroom, accused of a crime that no longer seemed as open and shut as it had at the start. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Lisa stepped inside, her expression hesitant. "Judge Carter, I know you're impartial, but something about this case doesn't sit right, does it?" Naomi glanced up, her heart pounding. "Why do you say that?" Lisa hesitated before closing the door behind her. "Because I saw the way you looked at him when he first walked in. You recognized him." Naomi's breath caught, but she forced her expression to remain composed. "That has nothing to do with this case." Lisa studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Understood, Your Honor." She turned to leave, but then hesitated. "Just be careful. The system doesn't always like when things don't go as expected." As the door clicked shut, Naomi let out a shaky breath. She knew that all too well. The courtroom was packed when the trial resumed. Naomi scanned the faces in the jury box, noting the tension that hung in the air. Lisa stood, adjusting her blazer. "The defense calls Marcus Reed to the stand." A murmur rippled through the room. Marcus stood, his shackles clinking softly as he walked forward. Naomi's chest tightened. He took his oath, then sat, his posture stiff. Lisa stepped closer. "Mr. Reed, have you ever been convicted of a violent crime?" Marcus's jaw clenched. "No." "Have you ever been arrested for armed robbery?" "No." Lisa paced slightly. "Tell me, on the night of the incident, where were you?" "I was walking home," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I had just left my friend Caleb's apartment." Lisa nodded. "And why isn't Caleb here to confirm that?" Marcus exhaled through his nose. "Because he doesn't trust the police. He doesn't want to be involved." Lisa let that sit for a moment before stepping closer. "Have you ever been inside the store that was robbed?" Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, a few times, but not that night." Lisa turned to the jury. "Mr. Reed is not a stranger to that store. He has been there before, but being a regular customer is not the same as being a criminal." Whitaker stood. "Objection," leading the jury. "Sustained," Naomi said, forcing herself to maintain neutrality. Lisa rephrased. "Mr. Reed, did you rob that store?" Marcus met her gaze. "No." Silence. Lisa let the words settle before turning toward the jury. No further questions. Whitaker strode forward. "Mr. Reed, if you're innocent, why did you run when the police approached you?" Marcus's fingers clenched on the stand. "Because I've been stopped before, and every time, it's the same thing. They assume I did something." "So you admit you have a history with law enforcement?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "I admit I know how this works." Whitaker smirked, turning to the jury. Nothing further. Naomi tapped her gavel. "Court adjourned until tomorrow." As the courtroom emptied, Naomi remained seated, her gaze lingering on Marcus as he was escorted away. For the first time in her career, she didn't know if justice would be served. And for the first time in her life, she wondered if the law she had dedicated herself to was truly blind, or if it only pretended to be. The words hung in the air like an unspoken prayer. "Not guilty." A ripple of gasps spread through the courtroom, followed by hushed murmurs. Naomi Carter struck her gavel twice, calling for order. But her own heart was hammering against her ribs, her composure on the verge of collapse. Marcus Reed sat motionless at the defense table, his fingers still cuffed, clenched together so tightly his knuckles turned white. He hadn't reacted. No relief, no elation, just a hollow stillness, as if he wasn't sure the verdict was real. Lisa Dawson exhaled sharply, the tension leaving her shoulders for the first time in days. Beside her, Marcus's hands trembled slightly. She whispered something to him, but he didn't seem to hear. "The jury has spoken," Naomi announced, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. She turned to Marcus. "Mr. Reed, you are free to go." The bailiff stepped forward, unlocking his cuffs with a metallic click. Marcus's fingers twitched as he rubbed his raw wrists, the red marks from the restraints standing out against his skin. Slowly he rose to his feet. Naomi expected him to glance her way, to meet her eyes. He didn't. Instead, he looked past her, toward the exit. A victory. But not a triumph. Whitaker, the prosecutor, sat stone-faced at his table. He had lost, but there was no outrage, no protests, just a quiet calculation in his eyes. Naomi knew men like him didn't accept defeat easily. She gavelled the session closed. "All rise," the bailiff called as she stood. One by one, the jurors filed out. Reporters scribbled frantically, some already whispering into their phones. A few spectators murmured amongst themselves, but the energy in the room was muted. No grand celebration, no overwhelming relief. Marcus Reed had been found not guilty, but that was not the same as proven innocent. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon air was thick with humidity. Marcus stepped into the daylight as a free man, blinking against the sun. Lisa walked beside him, her hands stuffed into her pockets. "You should feel good about this," she said, glancing sideways at him. Marcus let out a low breath, his eyes scanning the street as if expecting someone to jump out and tell him it had all been a mistake. "It doesn't change anything," he muttered. Lisa frowned. "What do you mean? You won." Marcus turned to her then, his expression unreadable. "I was never supposed to win." Lisa's mouth opened, but no words came. Naomi stood near the entrance, watching them from a distance. She had seen this before. The quiet aftermath of a trial, the way freedom sometimes felt heavier than a sentence. She took a step forward. "Marcus." He stopped, his back straightening at the sound of his name. For the first time since the trial began, he turned to face her. Naomi searched his face, looking for something, anything that would bridge the years between them. "You don't owe me anything," Marcus said before she could speak. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Not an apology, not an explanation. Naomi swallowed. "I wasn't going to offer either." Marcus raised an eyebrow, waiting. She took another step closer. "But I want to know the truth." Marcus studied her for a long moment. Then he exhaled. "The truth? The truth is, I never even walked past that damn store that night. The cops pulled me over because I was a black man walking alone. That was all it took." Lisa, standing slightly behind him, looked away, her jaw tight. Naomi's chest ached, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "And Caleb? He really could have confirmed your alibi?" Marcus let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, but you think he'd stick his neck out for me? In this city?" He shook his head. "We both knew the risk." Naomi sighed. "I wish," Marcus cut her off with a quiet laugh. "Not cruel, just tired." Don't say you wish things had been different." Naomi pressed her lips together, because he was right. Wishing changed nothing. Instead, she extended her hand. Marcus hesitated. For a brief second, she thought he would turn away. But then, slowly, he reached out. Their hands met. Not as friends, not as judge and defendant, but as two people who had once shared a past. Marcus let go first. He glanced at Lisa, then at the street ahead. "I should go." Naomi nodded. "Take care of yourself, Marcus." His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer. Then he turned, walking away down the steps of the courthouse. Lisa hesitated before following. Naomi stood there watching as Marcus disappeared into the city. He was free, but she knew better than anyone. Freedom wasn't the same as justice. And for the first time in her career, she wondered if the law had ever truly been on the side of the truth. Naomi Carter sat alone in the empty courtroom, the weight of the gavel still resting in her hand. The echoes of the trial lingered in the silence, the clipped arguments, the murmurs of the jury, the quiet resolve in Marcus's voice. The law had spoken. But justice? That was another question entirely. She stood, smoothing out the folds of her robe before exiting the courtroom. The hallways of the courthouse were nearly deserted now, the chaos of the trial fading into the background. Through the glass doors, she caught a glimpse of Marcus standing near the street, speaking with Lisa. His posture was relaxed, but Naomi knew better. No man walked out of a trial like that unscarred. For a moment she considered going to him, offering something, an apology, an explanation, anything to fill the space between them. But what could she possibly say? That she regretted not fighting harder for him all those years ago? That she wished she had reached out before the world pushed them to opposite sides? Marcus turned his head slightly, as if sensing her watching. Their eyes met just for a second. Then, without a word, he gave her a slow nod. Not of gratitude, not of forgiveness, just understanding. And maybe, for now, that was enough. Naomi stepped outside as the warm evening breeze wrapped around her. The city hummed with life, cars rushing past, voices rising and falling on the streets. For the first time in years she felt uncertain, not about the law, but about her place in it. The system had flaws, deep ones. She had always known that. But today she had seen it from the other side, the side where a single assumption could ruin a life. She glanced back at the courthouse steps. the weight of Marcus's words still pressing on her. "You know now, don't you?" Yes, she did, and she wasn't sure she could ignore it anymore. With a deep breath, Naomi walked forward, disappearing into the city. A judge, a woman, a friend, and maybe, just maybe, something more. Something willing to change. This story wasn't just about a courtroom, a verdict, or a case file. It was about the weight of assumptions, the power of choices, and the cracks in a system that doesn't always get it right. Naomi thought she knew the law, but in the end she had to ask herself, does the law always serve the truth? And Marcus? He walked free, but was he ever truly free? How many others have faced what he did without a second chance? Now I want to hear from you. What did this story make you feel? What lessons do you take from it? Have you ever experienced a moment where the truth and justice didn't align? Let's talk about it in the comments. If this story moved you, if it made you think, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more powerful stories to life, because stories like this, they matter, and so do your voices.